Game 1 of the World Chess Championship 2016 from New York is in the books. Magnus Carlsen was white against Sergey Karjakin, and this is what we saw. He started out with the Trumpowski. Interesting because of the plays on Trump-owski. There were a lot of comments about this. Magnus Carlsen was even asked about this in the post-game press conference, but you can check out Chess Center on chess.com and see what he had to say about it. It was interesting, though. We'll say that it's not the first time Magnus Carlsen has played the Trumpowski, and that's all I'm going to highlight here. It wasn't something that Camp Karjakin should have been completely surprised about. This variation here is very typical. White's giving up the bishop pair, so black has two bishops for the potential of two things. Often to get a better pawn structure, as you've already seen here, and sometimes for some tactical tricks in the opening. Sometimes there's opportunities in a little bit more of an obscure approach like this to surprise your opponent. And that's something that Magnus was trying to do in this game, which we learned very clearly when he took on c5 and then played the move 6, bishop to b5. Not a technical Dr. Evil's quotation fingers novelty, but a novelty as far as our practical purposes are concerned. Had never been played by anybody close to these players' levels. The last time this position was played by super GMs, for you to note and take home, was when Fabiano Caruana played Anish Giri. He played the move 6, c3. It's a principled move. c3 protects b4. b4, when played, will protect c5. And if white, of course, can hold on to this extra pawn on the queen side, we have sort of a reverse Slav defense, right? Black is going to get a big old center, and white's going to try to hold on to the extra pawn. So after a few more moves, we had exactly that type of it's a very reverse Botvinnik Semislav-esque type game, if that's a thing. And so I encourage you to go ahead and check out that game between Caruana and Giri. But that's really the only time this had ever been played at a high level until now. Bishop to b5 was played, and Sergey had to take some time here, but he played e6, a principled move that defends the d-pawn and opens up chances to go ahead and capture here. A good lesson for amateurs and players of lower levels to take home when they see guys like this play is, remember that the principles of chess, like grabbing a big center, should always be on your mind, but the concretes of the position, the concrete factors, have to be considered. And what black is worried about is very aggressive strikes by white in the center to try to pry things open, and maybe this d-pawn is going to need some more defense. That's sort of what ends up happening in this game, and black just wanted to have a little bit more of a solid approach here before extending too big in the center. So again, in this game, he played the move e6, and after we saw c4, takes, and now knight to d2, here we're officially seeing the first novelty. Again, bishop b5 might as well have been. It's where Sergey Karjakin took most of the time that he took in the game. But this is the first official move. The only move that had been played before this was the move knight to c3, but the knight is misplaced here in a position where the knight doesn't get any real advantage on this slightly more aggressively developed square compared to d2. And after the only game that occurred in this line, black was actually better in a few moves. King e7, probably white needs to take here, but then white's giving the chances to get the pawn. Problem is, white ended up really not getting those chances anyway. After knight a5, black really gobbled up this pawn and held on to it and was better in this game. So again, Magnus not interested in that. He played the move knight to d2. I'm going to guess that Carlsen was still in his preparation as we look at this entire video series I'm going to do, analyzing every game as it's played for the fans right here on YouTube and Facebook. I'm going to say that one of the things we'll have to watch is the battle of opening preparation as it goes on. Do players repeat the same openings they had in previous games in the match, try to improve later in the middle game? Maybe they think they had something that they missed, or do they abandon an opening after just one time of playing it? I'm going to go out on a limb here and make a prediction that we don't really see the Trumpowski again by Magnus Carlsen in this match. Take it or leave it. We'll see if Danny's right, because I'll be doing a video on every game. After bishop takes c5, knight to f3, a natural move castles. For those of you screaming about the fact that black just put his king in an open position, and you'd be right. Good chess tip. Go ahead and take it home and put it in your pocket. You don't want to put your king in a position where it's completely open. The emperor has lost his clothes. But in a position where your opponent doesn't have easy access to that side of the board. Also, a big factor. If the particular color squares you've weakened, in this case the dark squares, are not a color that your opponent has a bishop for, So again, I'll say that again. You're putting your king in a position where, yes, there are potential weaknesses, but your opponent doesn't have they don't have the tools to expose those weaknesses per se. Of course, if you give white a ton of moves and this queen comes over and rooks get jiggy with it, of course, anything can be bad with an open king. But just note that this really isn't a huge issue for black to castle here. And again, my goal when I do these videos is to provide educational insight, not just do what every other chess commentator is doing and saying, here's what happened, here what the result was. What can we learn from these games? This is something I think a lot of fans of lower levels are kind of reacting to, like, how can you do this? But the thing is, there's not really a way for white to take advantage of that, at least not with a dark square bishop. But continuing, again, these are natural moves, and I'm going to guess, as I said, that both sides were still in preparation. In fact, as Magnus Carlsen brings his pieces to a position, preparing to gobble up this c-pawn, I think he was still in his preparation all the way to here. I don't know if he had prepared more for bishop d7 or a6. I think both those moves, I'm sure, were prepared. In the end, though, Karjakin played, I think, the more principled bishop d7, the move that forces trades but also completes development, rather than playing a move like a6. And one of the things we're going to see is a common theme in this educational analysis I'm going to give you is that when you push pawns, they can't go back. Hashtag thanks, Captain Obvious, but it's important at this level because every pawn you push is a potential new square or new weakness because it can't go back. And so players of this level are very aware of the bigger picture, the forest through the trees. How are the pieces going to get traded? What transition is about to happen on the board? So moves like a6 and b6, moves that create squares. Karjakin is being very, he's thinking very, very far into the future. He's trying to have foresight with his decisions. And again, if he had played the move a6 and the move bishop takes c4 had occurred, now if this knight comes in, you see what I'm talking about. Immediately this b6 square is under fire. If you allow it, that pony could be very strong there. And I think white actually has more of an edge here than he did in the game. So a principled way to get trades but not create weaknesses. And then Karjakin faced with this very interesting move, queen c3. Again, I'm still pretty sure Carlsen was in preparation. It's a very good move, queen to c3. It hits the knight, it hits the pawn on f6, and it opens up the threat that if this knight comes to e4, the queen and knight are ganging up on the open squares. The one way you might see what I said backfire, that white doesn't have a dark square bishop if this pawn comes under fire. But Karjakin doesn't take the bait of making the easy move to defend the knight here. What's the obvious way? Well, b6, right? But if we end up getting the same type of endgame we saw in this game, that move could have been a huge mistake, allowing very quick and easy access to an open light square where a knight could have dominated a bishop. And if you haven't seen the game yet, you're going to see that that's something that was key later on, the imbalance there between the knight and bishop. Karjakin didn't do that. He played the very accurate queen to d5, which prevents knight to e4, and defends the knight on a5, and more or less forces Carlsen's hands to trade the pieces, because if you don't do something now against this c4 pawn, my rook's coming to c8, and Bob's your uncle, buddy. You might never get that pawn back. So Carlsen says, all right, you win. I'll blink first. Game of chicken over. We're going to simplify and head to the endgame. And before you think, okay, snooze fest, queens are traded, I can turn off Danny's video, there's still some instruction left, so stay tuned. First thing to note, just because you're in an endgame doesn't mean you can't lose. If you make any silly move here and you let your opponent get a rook on the 7th rank, you will lose equal positions if your opponent has a rook on the 7th rank before you do. Just pro tip, you will lose those games. So be accurate in how you defend and make sure your opponent doesn't have just a little bit more activity than you, because as less pieces are on the board, small things seem bigger. Right? When there's less to go around, a little thing can make a huge difference. So rook to d8 was played by Karjakin, an exclam viach move, hits the threat of checkmate, forcing white to free the back rank. And this might be our first real moment of controversy. Grandmaster Judith Polgard in the official post-game commentary said the move g4 was maybe better, a move that frees the back rank, but also maybe cripples the king side in a way that Magnus wishes he had, prevents f5, which if f5 is played, it frees the bishop. These are things that Karjakin got. I'm not going to go as far to say that that gives Magnus real winning chances. Maybe a little more than the game, and for Magnus, maybe a little is all he needs. There's also these outside of the lines ideas where eventually this pawn becomes under fire if this bishop leaves its post. So make note of that. But Carlsen didn't do that. He played the move g3. And after rook to d7, king f1, f5 does occur by black, and the bishop finds his nice home here. So now we're in a position where some maneuvering moves are going to be made. But the truth is, neither side really had any real winning chances or losing chances until a few moves from now. And we're going to get to one of those positions and show where Karjakin could have maybe gone wrong and provide some awesome insight, courtesy of our boy Grandmaster Robert Hess over at chess.com. Make sure you check it out. One thing that you always want to consider in an endgame is your opportunity, especially if you're worse, to take away your opponent's winning chances. Sometimes you take away your opponent's winning chances by buckling down and becoming the great wall of defense and nobody's going anywhere, right? Stubbornness. Sometimes you have to look for that timely trade that your opponent allowed that makes your life easier. The problem is a lot of times people trade themselves into lost endings, and that's one of the critical moments we're going to see right here. The move rook to c7 was totally possible by Karjakin, and at first glance you might be thinking, well, that's an endgame where I have a bishop versus a knight. That's not the worst thing for black, and even though I have these double pawns, we got a bunch of pawns for white on the dark square, so is this really the end of the world? I would say not. But as Robert analyzed and really did a good job of showing, the move knight to e5, surprisingly allowing double isolated pawns, was an exclam idea, a brilliant idea that might actually lead to a winning king and pawn ending. Don't believe me? Let's check it out. The king gets active, so does mine. Your king comes active, and now I get e4. If your king had gone to d5, I would have played king f4 and had opposition. So that was the whole point of waiting a move. You were hoping that I went to f4 first so you could go to d5. But in the threat of king to c5 coming here, white gets aggressive now over here on the king side. Taking is exactly the kind of thing you can't do and then try to run, because all of a sudden g4 and outside pass pawns are how chess games are won. That's exactly the kind of way that Karjakin would lose this game. So instead, after e4, king to d4 is what Robert analyzed. Takes, and takes. And what we're going to see is, again, a very close to equal ending is not a dead drawn ending. Sometimes who wins equal endings is the person who plays better. And in this case, the slightly more active king is going to get us in a king and pawn ending where eventually black is in zugzwang. That means you got to make a move when you don't want to, and watch this white king work his way up the board. Eventually g4 means we're going to get a position where I'll just make some sloppy moves to prove the point. Whenever you have a passed pawn that's further away from the ultimate goal, that means their king will be further away, and you will win this game. And that's exactly what white's going to do after king f5. So a cool note that this game could have been lost by Sergey with some immature and maybe aggressive tries to hold the position by trading rooks. But Karjakin, he knows a thing or two about patience. Like a good Russian schoolboy, he sits, and then the last chance, finally the white knight tries to maneuver in to create some light square weaknesses, but Karjakin doesn't take the bait. He knows the only way he can lose this game is not just if the knight gets here, but if the knight gets here and the pawn is still on a7. If that's the case, even if you're not winning the pawn right away as white, if that pawn's on a7, white can barrel down on it. That guy's not going to go anywhere for a while. He's going to probably overdose on Snickers bars, and by the time he does, white's going to win the pawn and go on to win the endgame. So Karjakin doesn't miss his chance to play a5. And after this, a few more moves are made. Finally, we will get that rook trade that black was waiting for in a way that doesn't really change things. And the draw is agreed in a matter of checks with the knights in a moment of just a few moves. And so where does that leave us? At the end of that, that leaves us in a situation where the first game was drawn between these two. And we have much more to go. It's only game one in the books of the World Chess Championship. And back to it, that was it. That was what we saw. Make sure you're watching chess.com TV and looking for our live Chess Center shows. And stay tuned. Subscribe to the YouTube channel here. Like this video and give it a share on Facebook to everybody who wants to learn something from these World Championship games. And we'll see you soon.